Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Hello, Councilmember Marcano.
How are you?
Alrighty. It is 10:01. So we can go ahead and get started. Councilmember Medina let me know that he's unable to join the meeting today, so we won't be we're not waiting on him. And we have our two committee members, and we have our usual suspects in terms of staff. So we'll go ahead and get started. The first item is the approval of the November 2nd meeting minutes. Councilmember Marcano, do you have any changes? And if not, do you approve?
I approve the minutes as they are written.
Same. So we have those approved. Any announcements for the good of the whole?
Councilmember Murillo, I have an announcement.
Yeah.
Hi, all. I'm a night manager of homeless programs. Just wanted to let everyone know that we officially have our point in time volunteer portal open for folks to sign up. Point in time this year will be January 31st. That's a Tuesday. And we'll have a couple different options for volunteer types. We're also having an info session next Tuesday at 6:30. And I can drop into the chat a link to more information about all of that. Also happy to email that to all of you. That's all. Thank you.
Yeah, if it's not already emailed, if you could send that out, love to share that and possibly even sign up. I'm excited it's on a Tuesday. Hopefully that means that council members can make it. I know that's been a conflict in the past.
Yep.
Any other announcements? Alrighty, well then we will move right along. Our next agenda item is the Aurora Mobile Response Team update. Jessica, is that your presentation or Angela?
Hi,
Courtney
Councilmember.
Tassin is going to take that one.
Just
Go
kidding,
ahead, Courtney.
And then I do not have the ability to share my screen right now. If someone could give me that access. Oh, perfect. I don't need to. Great. So today we will just kind of talk about a quick update. I apologize in the delay in doing this. We had actually looked at making this for the October meeting. We were just waiting to get back all of our metrics from our evaluation partner with the Aurora Research Institute. So with further ado, I will go to the next slide. So just to recap, most of you all know what the mobile response team is at this point, but again, it is a licensed mental health professional from Aurora Mental Health Center at this time, and then a paramedic or an EMT from South Rocky Mountain. Currently, they're operating Wednesday through Saturday, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. Now, this is a change in what we initially came up with, and that was because our data showed that we were having much more calls in the morning time. They're currently operating in West Aurora. We did expand a little bit out of Northwest Aurora as we were seeing a lot of calls for service, also within our District 2 area of Police District 2. They're responding to those low intensity active mental health calls. They're unarmed. They're not taking anything that has any active violence or mention of weapons. And they are taking calls through City of Aurora Dispatch. Typically, they're self-dispatching, so we have trained them how to triage calls that come through. Oftentimes, dispatch will mark something as appropriate for AMRT, and AMRT will review it. And sometimes dispatch will ask them to review a call. And then additionally, police are requesting this team as well. Next, please. Just some historical information. The team did begin its operations September 8th of 2021. So we are much past a year at this point. Very successful first year and excited to see our second year. Next slide. So this is where we have our data. So the total calls for service from September 8th of 21 to 10/18 of 22 was 507 calls. For one little mighty team, that's pretty amazing. I was actually very shocked that we reached this amount of calls. That's pretty amazing. So we had 29 emergency room diversions. And what that means is at the time of the call, it likely could have been a mental health hold, but instead the team was able to successfully de-escalate them, provide crisis intervention and safety planning on scene, or utilize a lower level of care, which ended up being around $118,000 of cost savings. And that's for the person, that's for the hospitals. So that's a pretty amazing feat right there. There were 0 calls where PD was called emergent to the scene. Pretty great there. I know a big issue or a big concern with this team was safety. So we see that this team is very safe and they make great decisions. So they've not had to call for emergency backup once. However, the team was requested by PD 108 times, which led to a cost reallocation of alleviating PD to $24,000. Our most common call types were welfare checks, suicidal parties, and post-contact follow-ups. Next. And then when we're looking at unmet needs, so at the very beginning of this pilot, dispatch created a code that could be input into call notes that we could utilize to track how many calls for service were coming in that would have been appropriate for AMRT. So as you look here, you'll see kind of just dots on the screen on this map, and that's showing where all of the calls for service that are coming in. And we had about 1,146 calls that were identified. So I wanted to caveat that this number is likely much higher because it relies on the dispatcher to put that information in. As you know, we've had quite a crazy summer and just an increase in crime as a whole. So with that, there's a little level of error that might be there. So we suspect that this number is significantly higher. Next. I wanted to share just a story of how AMRT kind of goes above and beyond. This was a story that PD actually reached out to me and provided a lot of kudos and thanks for the team for. So this is a little maybe out of how they typically operate, but it was just an example of how our public safety partners come together. So in early November, City of Aurora was devastated by another shooting of a juvenile. It was an incredibly chaotic scene. Officers were focused on the criminal aspects of the situation, but family on scene was obviously grieving and having a hard time. There were many children on that scene that were related to the victim. So AMRT was actually requested to assist while victim services was en route. The team welcomed the children into their van, provided them a warm place to sit because I think it was maybe 20-something degrees. It was very cold. They even stayed past their shift that day. They gave them snacks to eat, let them sit in the van, and just gave them a safe place to grieve. So this was a really excellent example of AMRT just going above and beyond to serve not only our community, but our officers and other public safety partners. I think this is the exact kind of collaboration that we want to see. And I thought it was a really great example. Next. And then that's the end of my presentation. Kind of quick, but I wanted to make sure that it hit just the highlights. Are there any questions from council?
Councilmember Marcano, do you have any questions?
I do. Thank you so much for the presentation, Courtney, and also for the great work you and your team are doing. I wanted to talk a little bit about that cost savings from the ER there. That's a substantial sum, and something that I think we were expecting to see from this kind of program, and I think part of why council supported this ultimately. But I'm just curious, have we reached out to our healthcare providers to see if since we're basically saving them a tremendous amount of money by utilizing resources to keep folks out of those holds and stuff. Have we approached them about seeing if they'd be willing to contribute some to support the program and expand our service even more than it currently has been expanded to, so that we can continue to increase the number of diversions and expand our cast a wider net, I guess. As your last slide showed, there's demand all over the city, not just in Northwest or just West Aurora. So yeah, is that something that we've done?
Thank you for that question, Councilmember. And as far as an official conversation or a formal conversation around that, no. We have had internal conversations about how we can leverage our hospital partners and potentially some funds from that standpoint. I will say our new partner, our new vendor is with a hospital system and offers a match program for the specific kinds of programs due to the emergency department diversions that we do see. So we will see a significant offset in cost due to that partnership there. But that is a great question, and I do think that that is something that in the future we certainly will prioritize looking into.
Great. Well, thank you. And again, just keep up the great work.
Thank you, Councilmember.
Yeah, I don't have any questions, although that was a really good one, Councilmember Marcano. I'm just really shocked's not the right word. Like I knew this would be a really successful program, and I was excited to see it go through. Excited feels like the wrong word to describe this too, only because it's you're dealing with folks in tragedy, right? So I will just say I am not surprised at how utilized this program is, and I'm happy to see how effective y'all were with such a small team, to your point. So I'm excited to see that. I see that this is information only. but I mean, I think, you know, I will definitely be sharing the success of this program, at my town hall later tonight, and I hope that we can share with the rest of council, so they can see the success that y'all have had, and yeah, I think that's it on my end.
Thank you, council member, and I'll be sure to pass on those sentiments to the team as well.
Absolutely. Alrighty, well, thank you, Courtney, for your presentation.
Thank you, council.
Alrighty, our next agenda item is the Aurora Housing Authority update. Is Alicia, or maybe I feel like I'm gonna get the wrong presenter, but whoever's presenting, you can go for it.
Good morning. I'm Dana Ashley Ohm, and joining me is Craig Moreshki. We're with the Aurora Housing Authority, following up on a presentation that we had a few months back on the Montgomery County Revolving Housing Production Loan Fund. So I know that there were some questions about how it worked or how it might work if put into Aurora. So is the PowerPoint available to be drawn up?
I think that's being shared by Maddie and Andrew.
Okay.
Just 1 second.
Not up yet. Oh, there we go.
Thank you.
Okay, so what we did is we tried to sort of digest what Montgomery County was doing and then sort of compare it to some things that we're doing here in Aurora. So here's a quick recap of what Montgomery County set out is some production goals, 41,000 units over 10 years. They partner with the Montgomery County Housing Authority as the developer. And then there's $50 million in bond funds and a $3.4 million appropriation that creates this housing production fund. The production fund provides this low-cost construction equity that is repaid at project stabilization. Okay, I'm trying to take control here, but I'm not sure I see the opportunity to change the page in the bottom left. So, okay, there we go. Yeah, maybe if you can just flip to the next slide, because. Okay, so then I wanted to talk about sort of what Aurora's production goals were based on their housing strategy. And so we have this goal of 7,500 units that are low income units, which is that bubble to the right. And those are serving households at below $25,000 in household income annually. 6,000 units for higher earners, and then another 956 units for new growth, just because I always think it's good to know where we are measured against the metric that we've set. Next slide, please. So I kind of wanted to talk about how we're meeting this need and what we're doing. The Aurora Housing Authority not only builds our own buildings, but we also partner as a special limited with other developers in the community. And so I wanted to look at sort of our development pipeline. So in 2022, Liberty View will come online. That's 59 units of senior rental veterans housing. And this was a state plus 4% tax credit deal. So out of the $20 million deal costs, 11.9 million were covered by that tax credit equity. Also in 2022, we partnered with Rangeview, and 223 units between 30 and 70% of AMI were added in the community. In 2023, we're bringing 100 units on using also the tax credit mechanism. So here, the $37 million deal is using 16.5 million in tax credits to help bring equity to this deal to serve those lower incomes at 30 to 60% of AMI. Next slide, please. In 2024, there is such an appetite in Aurora to develop. We are partnering with some other folks. Eagle Meadows and Jewel Apartments are two of our SLPs, and Peoria Crossing will come online. So again, Peoria Crossing is the tax credit deal, So out of that $30 million deal, for almost 15 million comes in the form of tax credit equity. Both Eagle Meadow, Jewel, and the Aurora Metro Senior Housing Project are also using tax credits. So this is sort of what I think Councilman Marcano was looking at is we have tax credits. Here's what's created with the tax credits. And is there another form that we can use to help supplement those? So in 2025, we're talking about building 40 permanent supportive housing units in conjunction with Aurora Mental Health. So just to kind of give you an idea of how this looks, let's go to the next slide. So of these inputs, toward our production goals, we're producing about 850 units with the tax credit program to meet this low income sort of bubble on the right. Next slide, please. So Montgomery County wanted to accelerate the housing development beyond tax credits, increase the density of developments, to create a low cost capital source to support housing development outside of the normal sources of funding, and provide both affordable and market rate units in one development. And the sheer size of these allows for that. So these are like 200 plus unit deals that they're doing in Montgomery County. Next slide, please. So the funding mechanism is bonds, right? The city, well, in this case, Montgomery County, but if Aurora was going to do it, the city would issue general obligation bonds for housing. The sale of bonds would capitalize a housing production loan fund. Housing production loans would be awarded to developers such as AHA. And then at a point in the future when the project is stabilized, typically a 5-year period, the fund would be recapitalized with proceeds from those deals. Next slide, please. So this is kind of a pie chart of how these bond deals look. So out of this overall 268 unit deal, of which 80 units are low income units, they are leveraged to the tune of a construction loan makes up 84% of their overall financing. That housing production loan fund makes up another 12%. So that is all debt on a deal. And then there's some owner equity that comes in the form of about $5 million in this case. So these are really highly leveraged deals. You assume that the market rate portion, as it evolves, can help offset those costs that you need to repay that revolving loan fund. So you're assuming that rents are going to rise aggressively annually and that you'll have more equity in your deal by the time you have to recapitalize that loan fund. So that by comparison, let's look at the next slide. And this was the other thing is timeline. So we talked about timeline of development, and it just takes a while to develop new housing. It just does, to find land, to get your financing in order and construct. And so I kind of wanted to create this visual of how long it takes to do a big deal like this with 250 plus units. And it takes about 4.5 years once you kind of conceive of it, put your financing together. Entitlements is taking up a longer period of time, especially for a deal of this size and magnitude. And then you have your construction period and lease up, which in this case, they allocate 12 months to lease up a building of that size. So we typically see with low income housing, the lease ups are a lot faster just because there's not as many units out in the market, and it's easier to lease up those highly coveted low income units. So next slide, please. So just wanted to kind of compare. So this was 80 units of low-income housing embedded in a bond deal, but this is by comparison is what a capital stack looks like for 72 units of affordable. So again, this is sort of what I was alluding to in my first slides, is that only a portion of this is a construction loan. So that orange slice of the pie there, that 10.3 million, so 10.1 million is your construction loan. And then your federal credits come in at another 10 million and your state credits at another 1 million. So, you are getting, the reason you can buy down those rents for those low income units is because you're getting this equity that comes into the deal. So you're not having to support that debt. You're not having to pay that. And that's what gives you the flexibility to charge those lower rents. So it's a much more complicated capital stack and limited you know, by the tax credit rounds that are available through CHAFA. But I just kind of wanted to point that out. So next slide, please. And again, just getting to how long it takes to put these deals together. If you get an award of tax credits, you know, you've got about 8 months to apply. You have about 12 months to close and get entitlements sorted out. And then we're seeing construction lasting, you know, about 14 months for a deal of this size for these 72 units, and then about 6 months for lease up. So no matter whether we're looking at the 3.3 years here to do a tax credit deal or the 4.5 years to do a bond deal, I just don't want anyone to assume this is a panacea, and next year we will have solved our affordable housing problem in Aurora. Next slide, please. So then I just took the Montgomery County deal structure and I kind of laid it out as I understand it in a simple way possible so that you could see, you know, sort of what your construction costs and overall costs of this deal were, which was 122 million. So as we talked about in that pie chart, the debt on it, the perm debt was about 99 million, and that mezz debt of 15 million is what replaces that bond construction during construction financing. So it's you know, another significant chunk that goes into it, and then this equity piece of 7 million. You kind of get to you know, how this deal is done. So let's go and look at this structure on the next slide. You know, the perm debt assumptions in this particular deal were in a different interest rate environment. So, you know, they were able to borrow this much money at a low interest rate, under 5, which we're not seeing much under 6 right now, to get to that hefty mortgage that they have on this project. Expenses also, I'll point out, so that PUPA is the per unit per annum expense to just keep those units up and running. And we're seeing those costs rising as well. But I'd say for affordable, we're seeing about 7,000 per unit PUPA. And this by comparison is over 10. So, you know, when you get into a market rate structure, there's expectations in terms of amenities and such that increase your overall operating costs as well. So let's go to the next slide. So just wanted to talk about, you know, knowing what we know about Colorado. If we were going to build 268 units, given the rent structures that we have in Colorado, what a typical rent for a private 2-bedroom apartment would be, you know, which is about $2,000 in Aurora. We called a couple of places near our offices to see what they were renting at. So this is sort of how you would calculate what you could do in terms of getting a mortgage. So you look at what rents you can bring in, you look at how many units you'll get those rents on, you assume that 5% of those units might be vacant at any one time, and so you deduct that. So you have $6 million in income to work with. And then I talked about that operating expense, so you deduct that, and your NOI is about $3.4 million, which at the time I calculated this, we thought we could get a mortgage rate for about 5.5, and I think it's gone up. But, you know, the reason that I think some of those bond deal worked is that it was a really low interest environment. And now the interest rates are going up. It just constricts how much you can get in terms of a mortgage. So, you know, if we were just going to look at what we could, you know, get in terms of a mortgage for 268 units of private apartments, you know, we could get about $62 million in debt on this deal. You know, as you recall, this overall cost of that Montgomery County deal costs $122 million. So right now we'd be looking at a $60 million gap to fill, you know, what it would cost to construct something like this. Next slide, please. And then we know we really have a desire to build and some affordable units within those buildings. And so this is sort of how it would look structurally if we took 80 of those units and assumed we're going to serve households at 50% of AMI, which you can see you get a rent on that of $1,300 a month versus the $2,000, which is the market rate rent. And then you could afford a mortgage of about $50 million, which then if you look at that red at the bottom, knowing that the deal was going to cost $122 million, deducting the mortgage we think we could get, we'd still have a $72 million gap on this particular deal. Next slide, please. And this is just sort of another, digging a little deeper. I know that Aurora wants 30% AMI units. And so this is just to do the comparison. If we really wanted those very low income units, the gap even grows further to the 82 million. So next slide, please. I think that, what we're seeing is that this kind of thing is being looked at in a lot of places. And the state of Colorado has their pilot program, their middle income housing authority, that they wanted to use this kind of program to serve 80 to 120% of AMI. And they don't have any deals that can qualify. So it might just be that the interest rate environment right now is not exactly conducive to this sort of bond funding. These are also highly leveraged deals, and the repayment of the bond loan fund is contingent upon aggressive rent growth. So, that can change. I know we've had developments where we've had market rate units embedded within some low income units, and we have never been able to get those market rate rents. So we'd had to deduct, the overall rent value of those and feed that project. So I think, the questions are what kind of developer wants to take that risk where, you've got so much debt on a deal and you're really, depending on the growth in rents over the course of time and the ability to, have those market rates grow aggressively as a way to repay everything. I think there's some places where it's good, but I also think as you're, trying to sort out what you're wanting to do in terms of meeting that affordable need, it may or may not be the perfect fit for that. Also, we just noticed that the limitation in land size kind of limits deals. 250 plus units is a big parcel of land, and there's not very many entitled parcels that fit within that we can afford to purchase and do a deal like this. Entitlements, that's another place the city can impact things, and we're seeing deals, growing by 15 months or longer. So I think that's an area that we continue to work with everyone and try to come up with ways that we can streamline that. I think my biggest question is if you're not using tax credits on these deals and you want to assume it's affordable, how do you do the compliance in year 5 to make sure that those 50% AMI units are actually serving households at 50% of AMI? So I think that takes some consideration too. In Montgomery County, because it was the housing authority that was their primary developer, I think there's probably some tools that they could use internally, to make sure that compliance was met. But I worry about these other programs where, there may not be the same kind of compliance expectations up front. So I wouldn't want anything to, not be thought about on the front end in terms of how this would be done. So I can't remember what the next slide is. I think it might be my last one. Thank you. Yes, it is. So, I really think we took what their model said. We tried to look at whether that, little bit of, bond financing would be enough of a bucket of funding to push you over. But given the interest rate environment, we're just seeing that gap growing so significantly that, you'd have to come to the table with a lot more equity or funding to actually make deals of this size work and meet your affordability objectives. So happy to take questions, but that's sort of our cursory review of the program.
Thank you, Dana, for the presentation. Councilmember Marcano, do you have any questions?
Several, and I'm going to have to follow back up with on a couple of them, I think. But first, I want to thank you for putting all this together. Sorry, for putting all this together. So I guess I want to start with the overall project cost. I understand that you were looking at the, kind of example directly from Montgomery County. But I know that we've had for-profit, just market rate developments here that have actually more units than this, including a wrapped garage, for about less than a third of the total figure that y'all showed here. So I'm trying to figure out where that discrepancy is originating from, because that, if all of this is, true and accurate, then it seems like no development is feasible at all, whether it's market rate or not, just due to the outrageous costs associated with it. And I know that the total cost of development doesn't look like that for this many units in some of the examples here locally that I've seen. So can you address that?
Well, we don't develop market rates, so I can't speak to that. But I do know that we were looking at a market rate deal that was looking to sell, and it was over 200 units. And they valued the replacement cost of each of those individual units at about 400,000 per unit. So it's high. Part of it is, the replacement cost, because construction costs have gone up so much, that it is creeping up there.
And Councilmember Marcano, Craig Morosky, Executive Director of the Housing Authority. If I could jump in, I think the one thing and obviously we'd need to see the numbers you're referencing, but our numbers were all in. So that's tap fees, dirt, construction interest, engineering, architecture. It's not hard costs, so it's everything. So maybe that might be a bit of the discrepancy, but we're happy to chat more about those numbers.
Yeah, I think that, really digging into that and how we come up to with these totals would be really helpful. I also wanted to just talk a little bit about the PUPA here. That seems like a very, very high cost per unit. And I live currently in a luxury market rate apartment. And I just cannot imagine them spend what they would spend $10,000 a year on in terms of maintenance per unit, especially given the condition of the building. I was the original tenant in my unit, and I've lived there now for a little over 4 years, I think. And just, how much we get charged for, like we have a concierge trash service. We have, all these other amenities that we do pay extra for. So that just seems exceptionally high from my perspective for a market rate, again, quote, luxury apartment. And I understand that these are just kind of like the numbers that you're getting, I guess, from like industry standard, but could you go into into that a little more? Like, what are those typically spent on? And, does that include the, paying salaries for like maintenance workers and whatnot as well?
Yeah, certainly. And this number was taken from the Montgomery County example, so I'm not sure I can speak to all of it, but it does include salaries for people who are on site, who work in maintenance, who work in property management, and anything else. It includes utilities for common areas. So if there's, a workout room, if there's a swimming pool, if there's things like that, it includes those expenses associated with that. And like I said, we're seeing now, in our affordable portfolio that we're running around $7,000 per unit. So, costs are just going up. Salary costs are going up. Material costs are going up. So when you have somebody move out of a unit and you have to replace the carpet, the cost of that carpet's gone up as well. So it's sort of a convergence of inflation and I'd say probably salary increases that we're seeing. I'm not sure what Montgomery County, would say is the reason for their PUPA. It's just always, we just pulled it from their example.
Okay. All right. And yeah, going on, I definitely understand land costs are a challenge. Available parcels are certainly a challenge. And this is an area where I think that, the city and the housing authority are going to need to be strong partners on, which, thankfully we're starting to do. We actually, I think, acquired recently our first, parcel for this specific purpose. And hopefully that is the first of many to come. So yeah, I want to thank y'all for taking a look at this. As I said, I need to actually follow up with a couple of folks and then circle back with you to kind of chat about these findings, because it's, again, like kind of what you're putting here basically says this isn't possible. It shouldn't even be possible for Montgomery County to do it, really looking at these costs. But it's happening. So I want to figure out what we can do to make it happen. I understand it'll be a challenge, but it's, I'm not taking no for an answer on this one, basically. It's an absolute necessity.
No, and if I could just jump in,
Yeah.
we're happy. I talked to Chaff a little bit about this model a couple weeks ago. So, we would be happy to maybe have a meeting. We could get Chaff in and talk with city staff and whoever, obviously council members would want to join. But, we're happy to kind of explore what could be done given this model. I think the one thing from a policy standpoint to consider is where do you want to, what basket do you want to put your eggs in? I mean, this is kind of higher income with some affordable units being subsidized by the higher income versus do you want to put more resources towards just more pure lower income? But yeah, we are happy. It does sound very doom and gloomy, but we want to be a good partner with the city, and we're happy to engage others to just kind of run through these scenarios and see what might be possible. So we're happy to help facilitate those meetings.
Yeah, for sure. And just from my perspective, from a policy goal, it would be to provide enough housing that we actually start to effectively compete with the private, for-profit sector and drive their prices down to compete with ours. That's kind of how these programs over time have scaled up and become really successful in other cities throughout the world. So that's my long-term goal. How we get there, I think, is a conversation that certainly needs to happen. Obviously, I would prefer to focus in on the lower, the folks who are most in need, frankly, and where we have our largest housing deficits, kind of following our housing strategy. So, again, that's another policy conversation that we'll have to have with council. But first, I want to address the technical issues that we're running into here in terms of the financing structures. So I appreciate the presentation. I appreciate the work y'all put into this. Thanks again.
Yeah, certainly.
And I don't have any additional questions. So again, yeah, thank you for your presentation. And if there's any follow-up, we'll have a new committee composition next year. But either way, it sounds like some follow-up with Councilmember Marcano is forthcoming, and can kind of cross that bridge if it warrants another presentation. But I do appreciate y'all being very robust and digging in. I'm excited that by the concept of that the Councilmember Marcano just mentioned, to your point about the immediate need and serving folks kind of that at the immediate housing income restrictions as opposed to kind of the long-term goal. I think it's a little bit of both. But yeah, that's a larger conversation too. So thank you both. Alrighty. Our next agenda item is the prairie dog ordinance. And is Brandon going to be giving the presentation, or maybe Jessica?
Councilmember Murillo, I think this is Marcano's to bring forward. So we have different staff on the call that can help answer questions. But this was Councilmember Marcano asked for this to be put on the agenda.
And just a quick clarification, Councilmember Marcano and I are co-sponsoring the.
I'm sorry, you are correct. I think you're both mentioned.
Yeah.
Commentary sheet.
I think we're both happy to talk about it. I guess it just generally, staff will do like an introduction, but if that's not necessary, Councilmember Marcano, do you want to jump in on this? I mean, I was interested in a staff presentation, frankly, but.
And Janine just popped on. So Janine, if you want to say a few things, we were able to meet internally a couple of weeks ago, and frankly weren't sure that this was the most appropriate policy committee for this to come to, but we had already agreed to put it here. So go ahead, Janine, if you have something you want to bring forward.
Brandon, I believe, may be in court this morning. I don't know if Dan Money is on the call because he is the drafter. So I was going to actually ask him if he could say a few words.
And I can do that. Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, this came to our office from the two council member sponsors to draft something similar to Parker, Colorado, for prairie dog relocation ordinance. We did draft something similar to Parker's. It's not 100% to Parker's because Parker has their code written in a different way than we do. But basically what this would do is to have developers put the requirement on developers to relocate prairie dogs in a humane way to someplace that will take or allow prairie dogs to be relocated. And at the very last, the last ditch effort, if there is no possible way to relocate those prairie dogs, that they are then, if they have to be exterminated, that is humanely exterminated. through whatever the state deems the most humane way. So this did go through the council member sponsors review and also their stakeholders. And we'll be happy to answer any questions on the legal side of things that we can. So thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Councilmember Marcano, any immediate thoughts at this time?
Yeah, thank you, Councilmember Murillo. And thank you, Dan, for that summary. The reason we brought it actually to Horns is because we had already, the first part of the conversation that we had working with Dan and the stakeholders was actually from the planning and economic development standpoint of, how does this actually impact development? Will this make it burdensome, onerous, et cetera? And the feedback that we received was that it would actually kind of fall in line more or less with our existing development schedule, so it wouldn't become really be a burden or ask any extra, if you will, of a developer, or kind of delay the process for development. So we wanted to bring it to this committee to have a conversation specifically around the animal services angle. How does this impact, that basically that part of city services, since there would be relocation, required. And, are we basically set up and capable of either facilitating that or supervising that? Where does the city come into play from that perspective? And Councilor Murillo, if you want to add anything else on top of that.
Yeah, and similarly, I wasn't aware that there was a debate on which committee, since, we've done Chapter 14 amendments here, but I guess that's neither here nor there. I think from my perspective, wanting to come with a policy, this was something that when we did kind of do that larger code review, was an issue then. I don't think it quite materialized in conversation. There were so many other competing, I guess, parts and revisions of that larger code that I think kind of took precedent. So that kind of took a back burner. So that's some additional context there. And then just wanting to bring it back for, review. I think I'm hoping that we get out of this conversation kind of concerns that we can start addressing. I think the way we drafted it was kind of the intent kind of predominantly there to relocate prairie dogs, trying to be as humane as possible in this process. And then also with the recognition that, from past conversations, that that's not always feasible. What is the alternative that way? So it really isn't meant to, as Councilmember Marcano mentioned, to be hopefully not as cumbersome, and hopefully, we see that other cities have adopted similar legislation. So we know it's possible. I'd like to know more of, from staff perspective, like the different departments that might be impacted. What are some considerations that we might need to continue to address before we go to a study session on the item.
Thanks, Councilmember Murillo. Marcano. I'm going to let Augusta Allen is on from Animal Services. I'm not seeing anyone from Parks on, but Parks representatives, please speak up. They were part of the discussion, as we have done some relocation from city-owned land before through our Parks Department. But when we met internally, this really was not something in the purview of Animal Services. So I'll let Augusta speak to that piece of it.
Hello. So because groundhogs, they're considered to be wildlife, it's not something we deal with for animal services. We only do the domesticated animals, cats, dogs, the ones that live inside. We refer these to the Division of Wildlife through the state. So we really wouldn't affect us at all as far as this is concerned.
Okay, Councilmember Murillo.
Thank you for that. is there a department that is impacted that can speak to the impacts?
Janine Rustad, Director of Planning and Development Services, and in reviewing this, a few questions, and we would, of course, would want to vet this with our development community, because of course they are not going to take actions and expend money until they have certainty through the development process. So this does have, I'd want to verify with them. I'm going on my knowledge of having worked representing developers, that this has that potential. And then looking at the Parker one, they have the 30-day requirement to try to relocate. So is there any room between 30 days and 6 months if this does add to the development process? And of course, we'll figure it out, but there's always enforcement. We'll have to look at Parker, what exactly is the documentation that we will require from developers?
Councilmember Murillo?
Yeah, I guess I was kind of hoping that the conversation would be a little bit further along, that like those things would have been kind of thought through and brought for the conversation today. So I'm a little bit I'm just not directly to you or anyone specifically really, but this item was postponed a couple of times because staff needed the opportunity to connect and discuss. Sounds like y'all connected and discussed, and I really I'm a little bit of at a loss for words just to in terms of process. Like I thought we were going to come here with that information to have that conversation. So I'm not sure where my thoughts are aside from that. Councilmember Marcano, did you have any thoughts on the stuff that was just shared or any or otherwise?
Yes, thank you. So I appreciate that, Janine. So just for a little bit of context, we didn't pull 6 months out of a hat. That came from our conversations, I think, with Dan and some other folks about what the typical development timeline looks like, because we didn't want this to be, something that would slow things down or be a hurdle. And we wanted to make sure that we were allowing ample time for the relocation. So from my perspective, I think, at least I'll speak for myself, I'm open to changing that if that is too long of a, time period before, groundbreaking typically on a project. So yeah, and I guess I'll just say that if this was not, since this is not an animal services issue, if it would have been more appropriate to take it to, the Parks Committee, something like that, then since if PROS is typically the, entity that would have to deal with some of these relocations, for example, I would have preferred to have been notified of that so that we could have shifted, where this went. Because now I feel like we're not having as in-depth of a conversation, I think, as we were expecting due to, some of that. So just a little more communication on the back end, I think, so that we're directing this in the right to the right place would be really helpful. Yeah, that's kind of all I've got at the moment.
Yeah, and Jessica, I'll look to you, but the way I read the draft ordinance and the discussions with Dan, that really it's the onus of the developer to relocate them, not PROS.
Right, and that
just for
sorry.
context, we did have a employee out on medical leave, so we did have to push this back. We did have the internal conversation about 2 weeks ago, and we did have PROS at the table, and they would only be working on city-owned land and city open space. From that discussion is what we got from them. And so when we met internally, this really did feel like the onus would be on the developer and the city. While we could create some regulatory authority, the state has some of that regulatory authority over the wildlife piece as well. And so from our internal discussion, it felt more appropriate for this to go to PED just because of the developer piece of it. This was already on for horns for today, and in discussions, we knew we had already postponed it a couple times. So we wanted to at least, allow this to get introduced here. So depending on where you all want to move this next, we can certainly, work with Office of Development Assistance and Planning and Janine's group on some of these questions before going to study session. But that was the rest of our internal discussion with parks and with planning, having all the right staff at the table.
Thanks. I appreciate that elaboration. Yeah, I mean, it obviously it sounds like it's not ready to go to study session just yet. I'd feel uncomfortable, given that there were expressed concerns and we hadn't kind of made an effort to address that. So I guess for me, next steps, I would be happy to meet with the team, Janine's team or whoever's the most appropriate team. It sounds like that was the right team. But I would lean on y'all for anyone else who should be part of that conversation. But I agree that it does sound like that is the onus, and we want to be as forthcoming with kind of the intention and how we might kind of work that out on the back end before this comes to study session. So I wouldn't feel comfortable forwarding to study session until we meet with the team. And I'm from a timeline perspective, I know the holidays are coming up. I'm wondering if that's feasible in the next week or so, or a couple of weeks, I guess before the end of the year, or are we thinking that January is more of a realistic timeline for, just clarity's sake?
We'll look at schedules and try and get something as soon as possible. I will want to include Dan Money, of course, who's been helping draft this. So we will coordinate some schedules, try to get something before the end of the year.
Yeah, and I want to be time sensitive. I also want to be realistic. Let's shoot for before the end of the year. If it's just not gonna happen, if we don't have the right people in the conversation, I'd rather wait till early January, just so that we don't run into this. Again, I don't want to misuse anyone's time. So that sounds good. Councilmember Marcano, any other thoughts on the ordinance?
Yeah, that sounds fine. Let's just make sure we have the right folks in the conversation, send it to the right place, so that we can get the animal, or the relocation portion of the conversation addressed, and also get a better understanding of how this regulation would actually impact the city process as well, and go from there.
Alrighty, so we're not moving this to study session just yet, but we're clear that we'll reconnect and then put it on the agenda after the fact, which probably, for study session, if we do move it directly to study session, would be in the new year. So sounds good. Anything, Dan, that you want to share before we end the conversation?
No, we're great. And as staff had said, there was a discussion of PED. Since two of the sponsors were on Horns, and we had talked about sending it to Horns, we did put it on we kept it on the Horns committee. But if it goes to PED, then definitely the sponsors and any other council members can always attend that and speak at PED if that is requested. And there should be, I think, new committees, chairs, or makeup next year. So we'll have to wait and see who makes up the different committees.
Great. Alrighty. Well, thank you all for the conversation and the presentation. And our last item of business is the Chapter 94 changes. Sounds like Councilmember Marcano is the sponsor, and that Sandra Youngman is listed as the presenter. How do you all want to tag team or introduce the presentation?
Yeah, I can just give a really quick brief summary, then we can defer to staff. So I want to thank Roberto for bringing up a lot of the issues, cost implications of this policy proposal. And I also want to thank staff for their work in putting together some estimates for us on this. So just for context, the goal of this is to allow our residents to get more timely responses to noise complaints that might be occurring in their community. And also, you know, kind of take this off of the plate, or at least be able to share the load at the very least with and of APD in responding to you know, these kinds of nuisance issues in community. So yeah, with that, I guess we can hand it off for the formal presentation and walk us through the findings.
Good morning, thank you. So as Councilmember Marcano said, this is just the follow-up. You had asked for some fiscal analysis and some possible scenarios on how, if code enforcement is added to this particular ordinance, that we would be able to help respond to noise complaints. So this is the breakdown of the presentation. I'll be showing you disturbing the peace and apparently noise report, breakdown of equipment costs that I obtained through different departments, costs related to code enforcement officers responding in different scenarios, and then the different scenarios. So am I going to be able to do, Andrew, do you do this or do I? I guess you have to do it, Andrew. Next slide. So I talked with the crime analysis, and they provide me with this following data. So, and they only had 2+ years of calls for service. So in 2020, as you see, there were over 7,000 complaints regarding disturbing the peace and noise complaints. And then in 2021, over 9,000. In 2022, we were working on 6,000 in October. Next slide. This is kind of a sample of what the calls look like coming from CAD. And I pulled just this sample out of the report. It gives the date, the time that they came in, what district. The big yellow blob there is the addresses. I didn't know if we wanted those in this particular presentation. And then the disturbing the peace noise, which is how that is grouped. They are unable to go any further than that into the granularity of the call. It just comes in as disturbing the peace noise. So next slide. What I looked at, and my first thought was when I was relating to how AMRT is actually responding to some calls. So this equipment training slide talks about upgraded radios, which the code officers would need, which would allow us to be able to monitor and scan APD dispatch calls. And those radios run about $6,000 a piece. Currently, our radio, we can talk specifically to dispatch for communication, but we hear nothing that's being scanned throughout the city. The computers, again, we'd have to update those about 5,100 each, because that way, as AMRT, they listen to the calls and then they can drill down into what the complaint is. So if we were to be responding to these kind of noise complaints, if we're listening, then we would need that, be able to have that access to those that information. Would also ask for 2 additional noise meters, which we use on some occasion. Right now we have 1, so I would want 1 for each team. Should that they wouldn't have to be traveling back and forth. We would be able to have it in the area at the time. And these training hours are actually, I pulled from the community service reps that APD currently has. Those are the hours of classroom time and equipment time as far as training that they receive. Next slide. Staffing costs for code enforcement, as you can see, code enforcement, that's just breaks it down to the hourly rate, time and a half rate, double time. And if we're working after hours on weekends, we would at least need 2 officers per shift, so that when we respond to noise complaints, we will be taking two officers for safety purposes. And if we're doing noise meter readings, we'd need 2 officers as well. So overall, that would be the staffing costs. And I would also need a supervisor on call available for any kind of assistance after hours or on weekends. Next slide. So cost breakdown, I just separately, equipment needed per officer, a radio, and the computers is about $11,000. And then broke down after hours or Saturday and Sunday coverage would be officers $47 an hour. If we're doing an 8-hour shift, it'd be $800 a day kind of thing. Next slide. So the scenarios I'm looking at is dispatch calls on weekday. So that's when we're working. The next scenario I looked at was just weekend response, which would be specific hours and specific days, which would be overtime for our officers. Letter C, excuse me, next day response, which would be if there's a complaint that came in through Access Aurora, we would receive the complaint and respond that way. And then we also have mediation services. Next slide. So dispatch to calls, again, is similar to AMRT. We'd be dispatched for disturbing the peace and noise. Code officers would monitor the MDC in their vehicle, in addition to doing their other daily work of responding to complaints as well as proactive enforcement. Code enforcement actually receives about 30 to 35% of all the complaints that come in through Access Aurora, so we're already receiving a lot of stuff that we're responding to. If we get a call disturbing the peace, we figured out it might be something we'd be able to respond to. We'd have to have 2 officers respond to that call, thus pulling them off of their regular duties. And in the wintertime, we are doing our systematic housing inspections, so that would be very difficult. The whole team is doing inspections throughout all the apartment complexes in the city of Aurora during September through April. Part of the ordinance was for people to obtain statements and other information, so they would respond, determine what is actually going on there. If hopefully the information in the computer is specific enough to know that it may just be a noise complaint. But if they get there and determine it's a safety issue, then they're going to have to call for APD assist on that. A noise issue, the ordinance requires obtain statements and other information, so they would gather that information, take noise meter readings if applicable. Investigation time probably for both officers could range from 1 hour to 15 hours. And that investigation time would be responding, review of the evidence, obtaining statements, noise meter readings. If a summons is issued, prep the court file, and then if court time if it goes to trial. Next slide. I actually had the crime analysis break out the complaints during the week during the 8 to 4 hours. As you can see, it's minimal during the Monday through Thursday, and on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, it really does pop up to a lot of calls, more calls than on the previous times. And this is over the year. So depending on how you look at it, it would be, 6 or 8 calls per day on the weekends. Is that a lot, or is that not enough for the expense to this? Next slide. So Saturday and Sunday coverage. This is the weekend response I was talking about. 2 officers at about $47 an hour, $800 for the day, a supervisor on call, and the equipment. That's just a breakout for that fiscal response. If we had officers working on weekends, that is overtime calculation, and that would be officers maybe working 6-7 days a week in addition to their regular work weeks. Next slide. Next day response. So this would be one where complaints are submitted through Access Aurora. Access Aurora sends it to the appropriate code officer. 2 officers would have to respond to the reporting parties, obtain the information and any other evidence. We would review and determine if there's a violation, and then determine the identity of the responsible party, which could be part of the issue. And then if there's a violation, issue a summons and prepare court files, which is a continuation of that previous slide. This takes the code officer out of the field to complete 2 code officers out of the field to complete 1 complaint. So next slide. We also do have mediation services. Currently, we have about $5,000 in the budget. It's about $100 per hour. Average case approximate time to complete is 3 hours, and that is through community mediations concept. With that, we refer the information to CMC, and they do all the legwork on that end. All parties have to be willing to participate, as we know in mediation processes. If all parties are not willing to communicate or agreeable, then that kind of stops everything in the moment. This also requires a code officer to respond to obtain statements, make contact, and complete the referral if applicable. But CMC does contact the parties, explains the mediation process. They work through the whole process with those folks. They do follow up and complete it after a minimum of 30 days, and any outstanding issues will also be addressed by them. So response after the fact is what this would be. And I would recommend increasing the mediation budget to about $10,000 We have not used this a lot recently, but it may be a service that we're able to provide. Next slide. So those are the different scenarios that I could pull out of what we were looking for, and I'm available for questions.
Councilmember Marcano, any questions?
All right. Thank you, Councilmember Murillo. And thank you, Sandra, for putting together this presentation. So I do have a couple of questions for you. And number one, the first one you kind of touched on a little bit here already. I do like that mediation approach. I think that, from my perspective, the ideal way to resolve any dispute is to get the involved parties together and get them to come to an agreement, right, without having to involve, the city or the state or whoever. So how effective has this been in the past, and how well utilized is it? You said because I know you just mentioned that we haven't really used it that much. So the existing mediation.
Well, I know I kind of oversee it specifically right now. Animal Services does use it, has used it several times. Our community engagement folks have also used it, and then it goes. We've used maybe 10 times this year. So so not widely utilized, but again, we might refer the referrals, but folks may not be willing to come to the table.
Sure.
We have a few that, one specifically I've been working with, and I said, are you willing to do mediation? Well, at this point, they're not willing to do anything, so.
Gotcha.
And it's up to Steve Shabana with them to try and convince them to do that as well.
Okay. Do you think that would be effective for this purpose, or more effective, or do you feel that we'd kind of get a similar response to how folks utilize, are with animal issues?
It's hard to say. I mean, if you have it, people right now are really unwilling to talk with their neighbors about a lot of issues. So, and we're worried about, the neighborhood issues continuing, retaliation, those kinds of things. So it's hard to say. Also, depending on the issue. If it's noise, people have different thresholds of what noise affects them.
I would say, Councilmember Marcano, if I can add, when it's an ongoing kind of chronic noise issue in a neighborhood or between neighbors, I think the mediation would be an effective, response. I think when people are trying to get an immediate response for someone's having a party or, doing something very loud and they want an immediate response, not as effective. So the ones where we have folks complaining someone's playing loud music in their driveway while they're working on their car, some of those things that are ongoing issues, I think, and there's no other safety concern, I do think mediation would be something helpful to provide as just another tool in the toolkit.
Thank you, Jessica.
I appreciate that. So following up, so it looks like we've had, frankly, more than I thought, calls for disturbing the peace and noise issues in the city. And it looks like it increased in 2021, which I don't think is that surprising. I'm just, again, shocked at the overall numbers here. And this year, this looks like, this is still accurate, right? But this is only through October 19th. We're at nearly 6,000.
Yeah, and it's projected to be 7,300 at the end of the year. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and again, it's hard to determine exactly what those complaints are. Could they be loud music? Could they be domestic violence? Could there be a number of other things? So it's difficult to know that.
Yeah. So looking at the costs for upgrading the radios and, getting computers and the noise meters and whatnot. So do you think that, I guess let me back up a little bit, because here's where I'm kind of leaning. I get that some nights, especially early on during the week, it seems like there aren't that many issues, which I think we can all be grateful for that. But it really does seem to pop off Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So given I guess just how much distress this causes some of my constituents, I'd be interested in maybe pursuing a pilot program. But I'd want to know if these upgrades for the radios and the noise meters, if we do approve a pilot program, but then decide that it's either not worth moving forward, renewing after a period of time, do you see those still being decent investments? Could we repurpose those for other functions, whether it's in your departments or other departments for the city?
I would think so, but I would have to double check on that. So I'm not sure what a pilot program for code officers responding. Is that what you're thinking?
That's kind of, yeah, the direction that maybe we're leaning in, because, or at least that I'm feeling right now, because you mentioned, when you break it down per day, it's not really that many calls. At the same time, anything that we're able to do, I think to, take things off of APD's plate and to provide better customer service with a more immediate response, is good. And we've seen that actually, we've seen the effectiveness of the Aurora Mobile Response Team, right? So that was kind of like the idea, at least the direction that I wanted us to go with this, is to kind of just have folks who will specialize on, with certain issues and kind of provide a higher level of customer service to our residents who are experiencing issues, especially ongoing issues, as, the catalyst for this endeavor actually was from one of my constituents. So yeah, I guess, is Roberto on the call? Oh, yeah, I see him.
I'm on the call.
Hey, Roberto. So yeah, I just kind of want to reiterate that same question that I asked Sandra. Do you see like the equipment that would be required for this endeavor being, easily repurposed by other departments and for other uses?
It's hard to say. I mean, I certainly know when I have expertise in something and when I do not. And this is one where I do not. So I definitely think that it's certainly worth exploring where we could kind of share uses. We've done a little bit on this, like the graffiti kind of brushes and public works and facilities and code kind of have some of those, synergies where we have equipment that can be used and by different departments. But on this area, I'd have to do a little bit more exploring and investigating on whether there is a use and reach out to other departments.
Okay. So it looks like the equipment costs, we'd be looking at about, just rounding at 280,000 thereabouts, right? And then do you know what the staffing costs would be? I see you have the hourly rate broken out here, but do you know what that would actually be over a year, let's say?
I did not figure that out.
Okay.
Are you talking after hours and weekends enforcement, or
I feel like that we'd get the most bang for our buck targeting weekend response, given that seems to be where the bulk of the calls are coming in.
So I could certainly figure that out for you, but the capacity of the code enforcement right now to take this on would really extend us out.
Yep.
We are still in the hiring process. The staff was not hired to respond to emergent kind of situations that we're talking about here. Yeah. So it is a different kind of job, let's say.
Yes, right? It is. I'm aware.
So
yeah. So I guess I'd like to know what that would look like. And obviously, there would need to be FTEs incorporated in this. So we have the cost for the materials, estimated here. I want to know what the cost for the actual, staffing would be. But yeah.
So staffing of how many, are you wanting staffing per year? Staffing of how many people?
Yeah, so I'd like to know what you think having a more rapid response option, especially over the weekends. So, sorry, let me scroll back through the presentation here. So yeah, oh my God, that is so poorly formatted on eScribe. I apologize, one sec here. There we go, Friday. So yeah, really like for Friday, Saturday, Sunday, which seems to be where things really pick up.
The 8 to 4 hours, or are you talking about after hours as well?
Yeah, that is a really good question.
Because we're going to run into some safety issues after hours.
Right. No, I get that. I get that. We have discussed that. I guess would you mind running both so that we can compare?
So you went daily and then after hours?
Yeah, if we could.
Councilmember Marcano, this is Roberto. Can I also offer in terms of annualizing or those costs that we might be able to also take a look at to Sandra's point, the appropriateness or not appropriateness for code enforcement. So we could annualize it with existing staff, or whether we have new FTEs that are actually code enforcement or some other area, park rangers, other,
Sure.
it's a policy decision, but I think Sandra's point is we are trained, and they are trained for a particular portfolio of activities. If
Right.
we're adding this, can we really do that with our existing folks, given staffing considerations, or is there some other FTE with a different kind of training, whether that's in code or somewhere else? I mean, I'm kind of running down scenarios, but I think that we probably need to explore that as well, because I think fitting this into what we're doing in existing code enforcement would be challenging for her staff, and that's staff that we are having a hard time even keeping and staffing up. So I just want to make sure that we stay flexible and creative about who might be able to enforce this. I mean, I think we've been looking at code enforcement, and that's the analysis that we've provided because you've asked, and I think you see the numbers here, but it's also raising for me the issue of just, is this the right place
Sure.
for this kind of enforcement? And given the emergency nature, given some of the circumstances that they may encounter after, it's not just it's after hours and it's more money. It's also just, are we trying to fit a square peg in a circular hole? So I just want to make sure that we keep that as a consideration as we move this through the process.
Yeah. No, Roberto, I think that's a really great point. And just so you know, I'm not necessarily married to the idea of having this be under code. If it would just not be a good fit here, I'm open to your suggestions as to maybe where else we could put this. Given the desire for a quicker response and to offload some of those calls that, are super low priority for APD or might not ever actually get a response, just given the nature of their other responsibilities. So I'm happy to have that conversation offline if that would be better than having it, now if we're not prepared to have it. But
yeah, I just want to make sure that we can give you the numbers, but in terms of what it would cost us to do that with existing. But yeah, let's probably have a different conversation about what other areas that we can explore that might be getting towards your goal.
Okay, sounds good.
Any other comments or questions, Councilmember Marcano?
No, I think that's good for the time being for me.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm still trying to wrap my mind around kind of the cost benefit analysis, like on the fiscal side, because I like it, the concept in theory, and I think it sounds like there's kind of like opens the door for some additional conversations that are a little bit outside of the presentation prepared for today. So I support kind of that follow-up to see, what type of position would be best if we went with one scenario versus another, or either way. And I think that the premise is that, we'd be freeing capacity from our police officers. I would imagine, I'm trying to get a sense of how to quantify that. I mean, certainly with just the staff time, the hourly rates, as a way to get to that, the cost savings. I feel like there's probably space for another, I don't know, category of cost savings. It's just not yet apparent to me. It's like on the tip of my tongue, but I guess if you do bring this conversation back, or when you do, to the full council or not, that would be my ask, is just to get like a more concrete picture on the staff, the cost savings, specifically on the staff cost. I think that's probably the easiest, most tangible thing, but I guess just any other considerations for the cost benefit analysis on the APD side. Yeah, otherwise I don't have any additional questions, but I support kind of that further inquiry, and I'm curious to see how this evolves. Thanks for your presentation, Sandra and Roberto, and Juan for bringing this forward.
Thank you.
All right. On that note, we are on miscellaneous matters for consideration. We have a standing space for updates from community. If anyone has any updates to share. I don't see any attendees. I'm not seeing any anything in the chat from community either. So I think we're good there. And this is our last meeting of the year. So I think on that note, I just wanted to thank everyone for all of your time and energy and work, and for entertaining all of the myriad of questions and concerns and ideas that we put forward. That is always appreciated on my end. I know certainly from Councilmember Marcano, just being willing to be thought partners and exploring different solutions to different problems. So I definitely appreciate all of your work. I hope y'all have a good holiday season as we enter December, and pass it to Councilmember Marcano for any remarks as well.
Thank you, Councilor Murillo. No, I just want to express my appreciation for our staff. Y'all make the city work in partnership with us and sometimes despite us. So thank you all so much for your diligence and your commitment to making our city a great place to live. And yeah, look forward to working with you all in the new year. Hope you have a wonderful holiday season.
Thank you.
Thank
Just
you.
want to say thank you for
Thank
those
you.
remarks.
Yeah, thank you all. We are adjourned. Thank you and have a good rest of your night or day. Used to signing off on council. Bye.
Take care, y'all.
So Andrew, I'm still on if you want to go over some tips and tricks that I have, or if you want to do it on another side. Actually, go ahead and stop the recording.